This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, and thank you for sharing this really fascinating stack of source material.
It's great to be here.
Today we are taking on, well, one of the biggest, most ingrained assumptions in intellectual history.
A huge one.
The idea that Western thought just starts with Greece, that ancient Athens is our undisputed intellectual homeland.
Right, and that narrative is so powerful because it's neat. It's a clean, linear story. But the sources we're looking at today, they really challenge that timeline.
How so?
The core insight here is that the relationship between, say, modern Western thought and Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle specifically, was one of, well, of historical import and aggressive editing, not a natural, continuous inheritance.
So we're not looking at some steady river flowing from the Acropolis to the modern world?
Not at all. We're looking at a historical sequence that was later converted into a foundational myth.
Okay, so our mission today is to trace when Greek thought actually arrived in the West, who is using it, why.
And then, crucially, to identify who, much, much later, decided to formalize this sequence into a kind of destiny. And, who benefited from that decision.
All right, let's unpack this. The sources say we have to start by separating Aristotle from Plato.
We have to.
Because the timing, the purpose of their introduction into the West, it was completely different. An asymmetry of arrival, I think you called it.
It is, and it completely upends the usual textbook story. When we talk about the first major introduction of Greek thought into the Latin West, we are talking almost exclusively about Aristotle. And this happens really dramatically in the 12th century.
Great translation movement, right? Coming into the Latin world, often through Arabic translations.
Exactly. Scholars in places like Baghdad and Cordoba had been working with these texts for centuries, and that's a crucial detail.
Why? What's so important about the route it took?
Because it explains the shape in which Aristotle arrived. This import was so foundational because he arrived as a complete, fully fleshed out system. Logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics. It was a universal framework for understanding everything.
Which is significant because before this point, Western intellectual life was largely structured around theology, rhetoric.
Pretty much. And what's so fascinating here is that this comprehensive delivery provided the West, really for the first time, with a full set of philosophical terms.
Like what kind of terms?
Concepts like substance, cause, potentiality, actuality, things that could operate independently of traditional theological language. It was like they were given a non-biblical grammar to explain the universe.
So he wasn't just another thinker to be put on a shelf. He actually became the language, the intellectual toolkit for those new medieval universities.
He was the intellectual scaffolding for the next 300 years, the infrastructure. But here's the critical contrast. In this exact same period, the 12th and 13th centuries, Plato was almost completely absent from the Latin West.
Absent? How is that even possible? The man who gave us the theory of forms, the foundational Greek thinker, he's just ignored while Aristotle is rewriting the syllabus.
His major dialogues were, for the most part, untranslated and unread. When you trace the source material, what was known of Plato was, well, a fragment of his Timaeus.
Which is used for cosmology, right? A kind of creation story.
Exactly. And the other image they had of Plato was filtered through Neoplatonism, which was a later, more spiritual set of Greek ideas that had already been sort of Christianized by the early church fathers.
So what they knew wasn't the systematic political philosopher Plato, but a kind of mystical theological Plato, and only in bits and pieces.
Which puts his arrival in a totally different context. The takeaway is clear. The foundational philosophical language in the West at this vital stage was built almost entirely by Aristotle, an outside material delivered as a package, not by Plato.
Okay, so that brings us to the next decisive moment, the real, comprehensive introduction of Greek thought in its original raw form. This happens much later, right? In the 15th century.
Much later. And this is where the story gets really compelling, because it stops being about intellectual infrastructure and starts being about cultural identity.
That's a key distinction.
The big shift happens in the mid-15th century, and it's tied directly to the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
And the influx of Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy.
Yes. That migration provided the Latin West with the two things it needed to fully absorb Greek philosophy: the actual texts and the people who could read them in the original language.
They weren't just bringing old books then. They were bringing the whole linguistic environment, the expertise to actually understand them. That must have felt like discovering a lost civilization.
It was an astonishing discovery. These scholars brought the Greek original of Aristotle, not filtered through Arabic or Latin, and crucially, the complete collection of Plato's dialogues.
Which had been perfectly preserved in the Byzantine tradition.
Perfectly. And the immediate reaction was explosive. The comprehensive translation of Plato's dialogues by the Florentine humanist Marsilio Ficino was absolutely decisive.
So suddenly, Plato is available. Not as spiritual fragments, but as this robust cultural and intellectual resource.
Right. And he could be used to supplement, or maybe even challenge, the system of Aristotle, which by the late medieval period had become a bit stale.
So you have these Renaissance humanists, Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, this highly educated elite, suddenly exposed to this lost world of knowledge. They must have thought, finally, we're returning home.
And that's the crucial point the sources make. It goes against the homecoming myth. The answer is no.
No.
For these humanists, this was a cultural reaction against what they saw as the degeneration of medieval scholastic theology. They saw Greek culture as an ancient intellectual golden age, a high watermark of sophistication.
So the feeling wasn't nostalgia, it was discovery, like they were finding a long-lost high-tech civilization.
Exactly that. It was astonishment, like finding a rare, highly elaborate item that was previously unavailable. Their goal was to use this knowledge to complement or refine Christian thought.
I see. So Ficino, for instance, he saw Plato as a kind of precursor to truth, someone whose ideas could be integrated with Christian doctrine.
He spent his life on it. Their attitude was one of return to a period of great sophistication. But it wasn't about defining a new origin for their entire civilization. They weren't wiping the slate clean. They were upgrading their cultural library with external material.
Which is a huge distinction. So if the Renaissance just saw Greek thought as this thrilling external resource, then who did decide that Greece was the absolute origin, the foundational myth we all learn in Philosophy 101?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because the construction of that Greek origin story that we live with today, that happened much later. It happened in two distinct intellectual steps.
Okay, let's trace those steps. This is where history turns into, well, destiny.
Step one is in the 17th century with a German philosopher named Johann Jakob Brückner.
Okay.
In his massive work, The Critical History of Philosophy, he basically created the standard textbook sequence we still use. Thales, then Socrates, Plato, Aristotle.
So he's the one who gave us the table of contents for philosophy history.
He did, but the sources are really clear on this. Brückner was being descriptive. He put Greece first because systematic, reasoned philosophy first appeared there in an organized way. He was just cataloging.
So he's not assigning any special value to it. He's just saying this came first, chronologically.
Exactly. He wasn't creating a foundation myth. He actually saw the medieval period as a corruption of Aristotle that needed to be cut out. He provided the necessary sequence.
Which leads us to step two.
Step two, the normative completion. And that is delivered by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in the early 19th century.
Hegel. Okay, let's talk about him. He's the one who famously said that coming to Greece felt like coming home. That sounds like the myth right there.
That statement was historical rhetoric to justify his own system. It was not objective description. Hegel made the decisive leap.
What did he do?
Three things. First, he unified philosophy history with world history, and crucially, with the history of reason itself. So history wasn't just events, it was reason unfolding. Second, he defined Greece not just as a starting point, but as the moment reason achieved self-consciousness, the moment thought became free. And third, to do this, he had to place all non-Western thought China, India, into a category of mere prehistory.
So he takes Brückner's simple chronological sequence
and transforms it into a necessary destined narrative that leads right up to his own time, his own German culture. He legitimizes his own philosophy as the peak of reason's journey. So yes, the Greek origin story is a very successful modern construction, an edited homeland.
The irony here is incredible because, as we said, when Aristotle actually arrived in the 12th century, it wasn't a cozy homecoming.
It was a massive disruption. It was this huge external material that forced a structural change. Suddenly, theology was being judged by logic. Faith had to be conceptualized with foreign tools. The world became an explainable object.
So the sources imply that the Greek spirit wasn't the West's ancestor at all. It was more like a dangerous private tutor hired later on who eventually took over the house.
That's a critique that is absolutely supported by the history. It was adopted and in some ways weaponized, not inherited.
Okay, so if Western Europe was importing and editing this thought, we have to ask about the people who preserved it all along. The Byzantine scholars who fled to Italy. How did they see it?
For them, it was completely different. For the Byzantine intellectuals, Plato and Aristotle were unequivocally the thought of their ancestors.
So for them, it actually was a homecoming.
It was a continuous tradition, a concept they called paideia, a whole system of cultural education. It wasn't a foreign tool or some dramatic historical discovery.
That continuity must have made the whole intellectual experience totally different from the Latin West, where it was all being filtered and translated.
Dramatically different. And the sources point to something vital. Byzantium had almost no linguistic tension between philosophy and faith. The Bible, Septuagint, the Koine New Testament, the Church Fathers, the classics, it was all in Greek.
The language of salvation and the language of philosophy were the same.
Exactly. So complex terms like logos or ousia were just part of their theological mother tongue. For a Byzantine, Christianity was the religion of the heart, but Greek literature was the mother tongue of thought.
They were in harmony.
A natural harmony.
But that raises a paradox, doesn't it? If they preserved it so naturally without all the friction the West had, why didn't the Byzantine world produce a scientific revolution or some other major philosophical innovation?
And that is the key structural insight. Byzantium preserved and commented on Aristotle's natural philosophy, but they didn't really develop it.
Why not?
Two reasons. The first is theological priority. Their big intellectual battles, the things that took up all their energy, were about Christology and the Trinity.
So debates about the nature of Christ and God.
Right. And those issues don't really prioritize natural causality. Nature, the physical world, was seen more as God's mystery or symbol, something to be appreciated, not dissected.
So the intellectual energy went toward metaphysics, not physics.
In a way, yes. And the second reason is institutional. They lacked the intense competitive pressure of the Western universities. And they didn't have that profound tension between philosophy and theology that forced Western thinkers like Thomas Aquinas to try and reconstruct everything.
The sources say that a Thomas Aquinas could not have existed in Byzantium. That's a really bold claim.
I think it's accurate. Aquinas was a product of a very specific crisis. He had to deal with a translated Aristotle, a foreign body. He was in the competitive institution of the university, and he had to resolve that deep tension.
And Byzantium had none of that.
They used Aristotle as a reliable tool, but they never let him become the skeletal structure of their theology in the way the Latin West did. There was no crisis that forced them to.
That's a powerful conclusion. The West roughly used Aristotle, which created friction and development, while Byzantium handled him too carefully, which led to stability.
Stability over dynamic, disruptive growth. And it shows that Greek philosophy arrived in the West in two distinct phases, was seen first as a rare finding, then was sequenced chronologically, and finally was normalized as an inevitable destiny by Hegel.
So what does this all mean for us today, for the listeners who have inherited this narrative?
I think it means that the idea of a stable, consistent Western tradition, starting with Greece, is itself a very successful edited story, a post hoc rationalization. The core of this knowledge was imported, disruptive, and adopted long after the fact.
That's something to keep mulling over, that whenever you encounter a concept or an origin story presented as this inevitable, unified homeland, you should ask a critical question. Who put that story together? And what specific foreign materials did they have to adopt and tame? Or in Hegel's case, what descriptive history did they have to turn into a necessary myth to make that whole narrative stick? That process, the editing, that's far more powerful than any neat origin story.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.